Welcome to Blush and Blood. One night at 12 o'clock, this happened, in a quiet little town called Maple Hollow, Ohio, where the porch light stayed on a little too long, and the neighbors knew a little too much about each other's business. Okay, before I get into this one, let me just set my brushes down for a second. I'm doing my base right now, just blending out my concealer under my eyes because, my God, this story kept me up last night. I was reading through old case notes, well, what I could find of them, and I swear my hands were shaking a little. So bear with me if my eyeliner's not perfect today. Some stories just get under your skin like that. So picture this. It's the middle of October, the kind of night where the air smells like wet leaves and wood smoke, and most of Maple Hollow is asleep. Most of it. But not the Rich family. Not that night. The Rich family, and yes, that's actually their last name, Rich, which always struck people as kind of ironic later, given everything, lived in this big colonial-style house at the end of Larkspur Lane. White shutters, manicured hedges, the whole "we have our life together" aesthetic. Patricia Rich, 52 years old, ran the local flower shop. Her husband, Daniel Rich, 54, was a contractor, well-known, well-liked, the guy who fixed your porch steps and waved at you from his truck. And their daughter, Eleanor Rich, 26 years old, had just moved back home about 4 months before that October night. Dabs concealer, leans into mirror. Now here's where I want you to really lock in, because this is the part that still doesn't sit right with half the town, even now. At 12:04 a.m., a neighbor named Carol Whitfield, sweet older woman, lived 2 houses down, the kind who always had her porch light on and her curtains slightly open. She heard something. Not a scream exactly. More like a single, sharp shout, cut off fast. Like someone tried to yell and then couldn't anymore. Carol told police later that she almost didn't get up. She told herself it was probably just raccoons getting into the trash cans again, or maybe the Henderson's dog barking at nothing the way it always did. But something about it sat wrong in her stomach. She said it felt different. Heavier somehow. So she got up. She walked to her window. And what she saw made her blood run cold. The Rich family's porch light, the one that was always on, every single night, like clockwork, was off. Completely off. For the first time in the 4 years she'd lived next door. Sets down concealer brush, picks up foundation. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is the kind of detail that true crime nerds like me live for. A porch light. That's it. That's all it takes sometimes to know something is wrong, before you even know what. Carol almost called it in right then. Almost. But she didn't, and that single decision, that little hesitation, would haunt her for years afterward. Because she waited until morning. She told herself she was overreacting. She went back to bed. By the time the sun came up over Larkspur Lane, it was already too late. At 7:42 a.m., Daniel Rich's business partner, a man named Russell Cobb, showed up at the house because Daniel hadn't answered his phone all morning, which, for a man who answered every call like his life depended on it, was deeply unusual. Russell knocked. No answer. He tried the door. It was unlocked. Blending foundation slower now, voice dropping. And when Russell stepped inside the quiet house, the first thing he noticed, before he saw anything else, was the smell. Faint. Metallic. Wrong. He found Patricia Rich at the bottom of the staircase. She wasn't moving. And upstairs, in a bedroom that still had the bed perfectly made, like nobody had even tried to sleep in it that night, Eleanor Rich was gone. Not dead. Gone. Vanished, as if she'd simply stepped out of her own life and never come back. One body. One missing daughter. And a husband, Daniel Rich, who police found 40 minutes later sitting in his own truck, parked 3 blocks away, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white, saying nothing. Staring at nothing. Like a man who had seen something he could never unsee. That's where this story begins, you guys. A dead woman. A vanished daughter. And a husband who wouldn't speak a single word for nearly 6 hours. So who was Patricia Rich, really? Because the woman this town thought they knew, she wasn't who everybody assumed. Picking up a warm-toned blush now, the kind that makes you look alive even when you're talking about something that isn't. So let's talk about Patricia Rich. Because everybody in Maple Hollow had an opinion about her, and almost none of those opinions matched up once police started digging. On the surface, Patricia was the woman who ran Hollow Blooms, the flower shop on Main Street that had been there since before half the town was born. She did the flowers for every wedding, every funeral, every homecoming dance. She knew everybody's anniversary dates better than they did. People described her as warm, reliable. The kind of woman who'd drop off a casserole if she heard you were sick, no questions asked. But, and this is the part that gives me chills every time I think about it, Patricia Rich hadn't always been Patricia Rich. Sweeps blush along cheekbone. Before she married Daniel 28 years ago, her name was Patricia Voss, and she'd grown up 2 states away in a small Pennsylvania mill town that, according to the handful of old neighbors investigators eventually tracked down, she never once mentioned to anyone in Maple Hollow. Not her closest friends. Not her own daughter. As far as Eleanor knew growing up, her mother's entire life began the day she met Daniel Rich at a county fair in her early 20s. That's not unusual on its own, right? Plenty of people leave their hometowns behind and don't look back. But what investigators found later, and we'll get to exactly how they found it, was that Patricia Voss had left Pennsylvania under circumstances nobody in Maple Hollow ever knew about. Circumstances involving a man, a fire, and a sister who, according to one very brief and very old missing persons mention buried in a county archive, was never seen again after that fire either. Pauses, sets down brush. I know. We're only in section 2 and I'm already giving you goosebumps. But stay with me, because here's the thing about secrets like this, they don't just disappear because you move 3 states away and change the way you do your hair and start going by your married name. They wait. Patiently. Like something curled up in the basement of a house, just waiting for the day someone turns the light on. To her neighbors, Patricia was generous almost to a fault. She gave away more flowers than she sold some weeks, especially to elderly customers who couldn't really afford it. She volunteered at the church. She'd been Maple Hollow's sweetheart for the better part of 3 decades. But her daughter Eleanor told a slightly different story to a close college friend, back before Eleanor ever moved home, a conversation that friend later repeated to investigators, word for word, because it never stopped bothering her. Eleanor had said, "My mom's not actually who people think she is. She's nice, but she's careful. Like she's always watching the door." Watching the door. For what? For who? Picks up a deep red lipstick, twists it open slowly. Patricia Rich's marriage to Daniel also wasn't quite the fairy tale the town believed. Several friends mentioned, almost in passing, that the couple had gone through what one called a rough patch about 5 years before the murder, a separation that lasted nearly 8 months, never publicly explained, before they quietly reconciled and never spoke of it again. No one knew why they split. No one knew why they got back together. And nobody, apparently, ever thought to ask. So here's what we've got so far: a victim with a hidden past, a marriage with a mysterious gap in it, and a daughter who vanished the same night her mother died at the bottom of the stairs. And we haven't even gotten to the secret that was sitting inside that house the entire time, a secret nobody, not even Daniel, knew the full truth of. That's coming up next. Switching brushes now, picking up an eyeshadow palette, tapping a soft brown into the crease. Okay, so here's where the story takes its first real turn, and I want you to really picture this with me, because it's the kind of detail that makes a true crime case go from tragic to I need to know everything right now. About 3 weeks after the murder, when investigators were combing through the Rich house room by room, a detective named Sarah Okafor, and I promise you, her name is going to matter a lot more later, found something in the basement that nobody, not even Daniel, claimed to know existed. Behind a section of unfinished drywall, tucked into a gap between the studs, was a small fireproof lockbox. Old. Rusted slightly at the hinges. The kind you'd buy at a hardware store decades ago and forget you ever owned. Inside it were 3 things. A faded photograph of two young women standing in front of a burned-out farmhouse, arms around each other, neither one smiling. A newspaper clipping from a Pennsylvania paper, 29 years old, about a house fire that killed one person and left another missing, presumed deceased. And a small velvet pouch containing a single piece of jewelry, a gold locket, tarnished, with the initials MV engraved on the back. Blends shadow into the crease, slower now. MV. Not PV. Not Patricia Voss. Detective Okafor ran the name from the newspaper clipping. The woman who died in that fire 29 years ago was named Margaret Voss, Patricia's sister. And here's where it gets even stranger, because the official report from 29 years ago listed Margaret Voss as the one who died in the fire, burned beyond recognition, identified mostly by jewelry and dental records, while her sister Patricia was the one who'd supposedly escaped and later vanished from town entirely, never to be heard from again. So why was Margaret's locket sitting in a hidden box in Patricia Rich's basement, 29 years later, 2 states away, under a different name? Sets down the palette, looks straight into the mirror. There are really only 2 explanations here, you guys, and both of them are deeply unsettling. Either Patricia kept her dead sister's locket as a memento all these years and simply never told anyone, which is sad, but understandable. Or, the woman who escaped that fire wasn't actually Patricia at all. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying that's the question Detective Okafor wrote, underlined twice, in her own case notebook that night. Because once you start pulling on a thread like that, the whole sweater starts to come apart. What made this even more chilling was a single line in Eleanor's own diary, recovered from her bedroom, a diary she'd apparently kept since she was a teenager, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on her shelf. Most of it was ordinary. Boys, friends, complaints about her parents like any normal kid. But one entry, dated about 6 months before the murder, just months before Eleanor moved back home, read like this. I found something in Mom's things. I don't think she's who she says she is. I'm scared to ask her. I think if I ask her, something bad is going to happen. Picks up mascara wand, holds it without applying yet. I think if I ask her, something bad is going to happen. Eleanor wrote that 6 months before her mother was killed and she herself disappeared without a trace. So now I need you to ask yourself something, because I sure did. Did Eleanor ask her mother that question eventually? Did she finally get the courage to confront her? And if she did, what answer did she get back? Because somebody in that house knew the truth about Patricia Rich's real identity. And that same night, one woman ended up dead at the bottom of the stairs, and another disappeared into thin air. We're going to talk about exactly who saw Eleanor last, and trust me, it is not who you think. Picking up the mascara now, finally applying it, one eye at a time, blinking slowly. All right. Let's talk about timelines, because timelines are everything in a case like this. And the timeline of that last day Eleanor Rich was seen alive is honestly one of the strangest puzzles I've come across doing this channel. Eleanor worked part-time at a little bookstore cafe called The Gilded Page, just off Main Street, about a 10-minute walk from her parents' house. Her co-workers said she'd seemed off that whole final week. Distracted. Quieter than usual. One co-worker, a young guy named Tyler Brennan, said Eleanor had asked him, almost out of nowhere, while restocking a shelf, whether he thought it was possible for someone to completely become a different person if they had to. He laughed it off at the time. Told her sure, people change. She didn't laugh back. Curls lashes, applies second coat. On the day of the murder, Eleanor left work at 6:15 p.m., same as always. Surveillance footage from a gas station across the street, grainy, but enough, shows her walking in the direction of home, alone, checking her phone twice. That's the last confirmed footage of Eleanor Rich anywhere in Maple Hollow. But here's where it gets interesting. Because according to phone records, at 8:52 p.m., Eleanor sent a text message to a number that wasn't saved in her contacts. Just a string of digits. The message read, I need to talk to you tonight. It's about the locket. The locket. The same one detectives would later find hidden in that basement lockbox. Who did she send that message to? Pauses, sets mascara down, looks directly into the camera essentially through the mirror. The number traced back to a prepaid phone, the kind you buy with cash at a drugstore, no name attached, no contract, completely untraceable through normal means. But here's the chilling part. That same prepaid number had texted Eleanor exactly 4 times in the 2 weeks before her disappearance. Always at night. Always short. And one message, sent just 3 days before the murder, simply said, "Don't tell her you know. Not yet. It isn't safe. Don't tell her." Her. Meaning Patricia. So somebody out there, somebody using an untraceable burner phone, knew that Eleanor had discovered something about her mother's past, and was actively warning her to keep it secret. Was protecting her. Or setting her up. Picks up concealer pen, dabs lightly under brow bone for definition. Now, here's where Daniel Rich comes back into focus, because remember, he was the one found sitting silently in his truck 3 blocks from the house, hours after the murder, refusing to speak. When police finally got him to talk, nearly 6 hours later, his story was disjointed at best. He claimed he'd come home around 11:30 that night from a late job site, found the house dark, the porch light off, just like Carol Whitfield noticed, and walked in to find Patricia already at the bottom of the stairs. He said he checked for a pulse, found none, and then, in his words, everything went black. He said he didn't remember leaving the house. Didn't remember driving. Didn't remember parking 3 blocks away. The next thing he claimed to recall was police knocking on his truck window. Convenient memory loss. Genuine shock-induced dissociation. Or something else entirely. And here's the detail that really got under my skin while I was researching this one, you guys. Daniel's hands, when police found him, had small defensive-looking scratches across both knuckles. Fresh ones. The kind you might get from a struggle. He said he must have scraped them on a loose nail at the job site. There was no job site that night. Russell Cobb, his own business partner, confirmed they hadn't worked a single job past 4 p.m. that day. Sets down concealer, exhales. So now we've got a husband whose alibi doesn't hold up, fresh scratches on his hands, a wife with a hidden identity, and a daughter who vanished after sending a text about a secret locket to a mystery number that had been warning her to stay quiet. It's a lot, I know. But we're just getting started, because once the investigation officially opened, detectives uncovered something inside that house that made even seasoned officers go quiet. Switching now to contouring, picking up a cool tone powder, dipping the brush. So once Daniel Rich was brought in for formal questioning, and once Eleanor was officially classified as a missing person rather than just unaccounted for, the case landed on the desk of Detective Sarah Okafor, a 12-year veteran of the county sheriff's department, known around the office for being meticulous to the point of obsessive. The kind of detective who reads case files twice. 3 times. Who color codes her sticky notes. Okafor's first move wasn't to grill Daniel harder. It was to go back to basics. Cause of death. Time of death. Scene reconstruction. The medical examiner determined Patricia Rich died from a single, forceful blow to the back of the head, consistent with a fall down the staircase, except for one detail that didn't add up cleanly. The angle of the wound suggested the blow came first, and the fall came second. In other words, somebody hit her, and then she fell. Or was pushed. Blends contour along jawline. There was also bruising on her forearms, defensive bruising, the kind you get when you throw your arms up to protect yourself from somebody coming at you. Patricia Rich fought back. Whoever did this to her, she saw them coming, and she tried to stop it. Time of death was estimated between 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., which lines up almost exactly with Carol Whitfield's account of hearing that single, cut-off shout around midnight, and noticing the porch light go dark. So here's our window. Less than 30 minutes. Somewhere in that half hour, Patricia Rich was struck, fought for her life, and fell to her death at the bottom of her own staircase. And somewhere in that same half hour, her daughter Eleanor disappeared from the house entirely, leaving behind a perfectly made bed and no sign of forced exit. No broken windows. No forced doors. No signs of a struggle anywhere except at the bottom of those stairs. Picks up setting spray, sprays lightly, waits a beat. which told detectives something crucial: whoever did this either had a key or was already inside the house. This wasn't a break-in. This was somebody Patricia knew. Somebody she let close enough to swing at her before she even had time to properly defend herself. Detective Okafor pulled phone records, bank statements, employment files, the whole financial and digital footprint of the entire family. And almost immediately, something jumped out at her. In the 3 months before the murder, Daniel Rich had withdrawn just over $40,000 in cash from a business account, in small increments, never more than $2,000 at a time, specifically to stay under the threshold that would automatically flag the bank's reporting systems. $40,000. In cash. Hidden from his own wife, according to Patricia's separate personal account, which showed no knowledge of these withdrawals whatsoever. Narrows eyes slightly at her own reflection. Now, you tell me, what does a contractor in a small Ohio town need $40,000 in untraceable cash for? Gambling debt? A second life? Or something far more deliberate, money set aside for someone who needed to disappear quietly, no questions asked? When confronted with this during questioning, Daniel's composure finally cracked, just slightly. He admitted the money existed. But he refused, flatly refused, to say what it was for. He just kept repeating the same sentence: according to the interview transcript, I was trying to protect my family. That's all I'm going to say. Protect them from what? From whom? Picks up a finishing powder, taps excess off the brush. Detective Okafor knew right then that this case wasn't going to break open through a simple confession. It was going to take digging. Real digging, into bank trails, into old Pennsylvania records, into a marriage with an unexplained 8-month separation, and into a daughter who discovered a secret she was too afraid to even name out loud in her own diary. And just 3 days into the official investigation, they found something in Eleanor's bedroom that changed the entire direction of the case. Something hidden so well that the first search team had completely missed it. Picking up an eyeliner pencil now, tilting head back slightly to get the angle right on the waterline. Okay, so this next part, I had to read it 3 times when I was putting this story together, because it's one of those details that just recontextualizes everything you thought you understood about a case. When the first search team went through Eleanor's bedroom the morning after the murder, they cataloged the obvious things. Clothes. A laptop. The hollowed-out book with her diary. Standard stuff. But 3 days later, when Detective Okafor did a second, slower pass, because she always did a second pass, she said it once in an interview: the first search finds what's there, the second search finds what's hidden. She noticed something off about Eleanor's closet. The back panel. It wasn't flush with the wall. Just slightly off, maybe half an inch, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were running your hand along every surface in that room. Carefully lines upper lid, voice steady but quickening slightly. Behind that panel was a shoebox. Inside the shoebox were 2 things. A second cell phone, not Eleanor's primary phone, a separate one, also prepaid, also cash bought, and a stack of printed documents. Birth certificates. Old census records. A handwritten family tree that Eleanor had clearly been building herself over weeks, maybe months, tracing backward from her mother's name. Patricia Voss. Margaret Voss. 2 sisters. 1 farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. 1 fire. But here's the detail that made Detective Okafor's stomach actually turn, by her own account later. At the bottom of that family tree, in Eleanor's handwriting, underlined 3 times, was a single note. If Mom is really Margaret, then who actually died in that fire? And does she know I know? Sets down liner, hand genuinely a little unsteady. Eleanor wasn't just suspicious that her mother had a hidden past. She'd built an entire theory that the woman she'd called Mom her entire life wasn't Patricia Voss at all. That somehow, 29 years ago, the sisters had switched places. That the woman who died in that fire was actually Patricia. And the woman who survived, who fled to Ohio, who married Daniel Rich and ran a flower shop and brought casseroles to sick neighbors for 3 decades, was actually Margaret. Which meant that the locket with the initials MV wasn't a memento of a dead sister at all. It belonged to the woman herself. The second phone in that shoebox told an even darker story. When Detective Okafor pulled its message history, she found an entire thread of conversations between Eleanor and that same untraceable burner number from before, except this thread was longer, older, going back almost 2 months. And in it, Eleanor wasn't just being warned to stay quiet. She was being coached. Step by step. On how to gather proof. Picks up a sharp black liquid liner now, voice low, deliberate. One message from the unknown number read, check the church records from 29 years ago. Baptisms. There should be 2 names, not 1, around the time the sisters would have been confirmed. Another read, be careful with Daniel. He might know more than he's letting on. Don't trust him completely yet. Don't trust him completely yet. Yet. As if trust was something that could eventually be earned, once certain facts came to light. So who was this mystery person, guiding Eleanor through an investigation into her own mother's identity, while simultaneously warning her not to fully trust her own father? Detective Okafor had a working theory by this point, and it was a name that hadn't come up once in the entire case file so far, a name that, when she finally tracked it down, made the hair on her arms stand straight up. Picking up a small precision brush, dipping into a deep plum eyeshadow for the outer corner. So Detective Okafor takes that second burner phone back to the station, and she's not messing around anymore. She gets a warrant pushed through fast, drags the carrier's records, and finally, gets a name attached to that untraceable number. Grace Coleman. 31 years old. Living about 4 hours away, in a small apartment outside Pittsburgh. The name meant nothing to anyone in Maple Hollow. Daniel didn't recognize it. None of Patricia's flower shop friends had ever heard it. Eleanor had never once mentioned a Grace in her diary, her texts, her social media, anywhere. This woman had inserted herself into Eleanor's life entirely off the grid, no public connection, nothing that would ever show up in a normal background check. Blends the plum shadow into the outer crease, deepening it. So Okafor does what any good detective does. She starts pulling Grace Coleman's own history. And almost immediately, it's like a key turning in a lock that's been stuck for 29 years. Grace Coleman was born in that same small Pennsylvania mill town. The same one Patricia Rich, or Patricia Voss, depending on who you believe, supposedly left behind. And Grace's birth certificate listed her mother's name as Patricia Voss. Stops mid-blend, lets that sit. You heard that right. According to official Pennsylvania state records, Grace Coleman's biological mother was a woman named Patricia Voss. The same Patricia Voss who, according to that 29-year-old newspaper clipping, was the one who survived the farmhouse fire and vanished. Except Grace Coleman grew up never knowing her real mother at all. She was raised, off and on, by an aunt and a string of foster placements after her mother disappeared when Grace was barely 2 years old. As far as Grace had been told her entire life, her mother abandoned her shortly after the fire and was never seen again. Just gone. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. Picks up a deep berry lip liner, traces the edge of her lips slowly, deliberately. But here's where it gets almost unbearable, you guys. Because if Eleanor's theory was right, if the woman who actually died in that fire 29 years ago was Patricia, and the woman who survived was really her sister Margaret, who then stole her dead sister's name and identity, then Grace Coleman wasn't abandoned by her mother at all. Her mother died in that fire. While her aunt walked away with her mother's name, her mother's identity, and eventually, an entirely new family 3 states away, a husband, a flower shop, a daughter of her own named Eleanor, who Grace would later realize was actually her first cousin. Grace didn't grow up abandoned. She grew up robbed. Robbed of a mother who died thinking, or maybe not even thinking, maybe never even getting the chance to think anything, because the fire took that choice away too, while the woman responsible got to live an entire second life under a stolen name, never once looking back. Sets the lip liner down very slowly, hand trembling slightly. Detective Okafor sat with that for a long moment in her notes, because suddenly this case wasn't just about a murder anymore. It was about 30 years of buried grief finally clawing its way back to the surface. A daughter who never got to bury her real mother. A cousin she never knew existed. and a woman in Ohio who'd spent 3 decades building a beautiful, ordinary, well-loved life on top of a lie that left a little girl in foster care 2 states away. So now the question isn't just who killed Patricia Rich. The question is whether Grace Coleman spent the last 2 months of Eleanor's life slowly, carefully, patiently preparing her cousin for the moment she'd finally walk back into that house and face the woman who stole everything from her. And whether, on that October night, she finally did. Picking up a contour stick now, warming it between fingers before applying. Okay, so with Grace Coleman's name now in the file, you'd think the investigation would pivot entirely toward her. And in some ways, it did. But here's something important about real investigations that true crime shows don't always tell you: detectives don't get to chase one lead at a time. They have to run everything in parallel. And right alongside Grace's emerging story, Daniel Rich remained, on paper, the most obvious suspect sitting right in front of them. Think about everything stacked against him. He lied about his alibi. There was no job site that night. He had fresh scratches on his hands that he couldn't explain. He'd secretly withdrawn $40,000 in cash, deliberately structured to avoid bank reporting thresholds. He was found hours later, silent, in a parked truck blocks from his own home, refusing to speak. And his wife had defensive bruising consistent with fighting off an attacker she knew well enough to let get close. Blends contour along cheekbones, sharpening the shadow. Detective Okafor brought Daniel in for a second, much longer interview, and this time she came in with more leverage than before. She laid out the timeline. The cash. The scratches. And she asked him directly, point blank, "Did you know your wife wasn't who she said she was?" According to the interview transcript, Daniel didn't answer right away. He sat there for almost a full minute in silence. And then he said something that, when Okafor wrote it up later, she underlined twice in her notes, just like she had with Eleanor's diary entry. He said, "I found out 5 years ago. That's why we separated. I almost left her for good. But I loved her. I loved the woman she became, even if I hated how she became her. I told myself the past was the past." Picks up a setting powder, taps it lightly onto a puff. 5 years ago. The same unexplained 8-month separation everyone in town had noticed but nobody understood. Daniel admitted everything, finally. He'd discovered, completely by accident, an old box of Margaret's things while doing renovation work on the house, the same kind of box, ironically, that Eleanor would later find hidden behind that drywall panel. He confronted his wife. She broke down and told him the truth, that she was Margaret, not Patricia, and that she'd let the entire world, including her own daughter, believe a lie for over 2 decades because she was terrified of what would happen if anyone ever found out what really happened in that fire. Daniel left for 8 months. Couldn't look at her. Couldn't process it. But eventually, he said, he came back, because, in his own words, she was still the woman I married, even if her name wasn't real. And the $40,000? Daniel admitted he'd started quietly setting it aside about 3 months before the murder, after Margaret confided in him that she suspected someone from her past had finally found her. She wouldn't say who. She wouldn't say how. She just told him she might need to disappear again, fast, and she needed money that couldn't be traced. Sets powder down, voice quieter now. So Daniel wasn't preparing to hurt his wife. He was preparing to help her run from whatever, or whoever, was finally catching up to her. And the scratches on his hands. He claimed he came home that night, found his wife already on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, and in his panic, in his grief, he'd clawed at his own face and hands without even realizing it, a detail the medical examiner actually confirmed was medically plausible, consistent with acute traumatic stress reactions, not necessarily a struggle with another person. Detective Okafor believed him. Mostly. There was still something about his account that didn't sit perfectly right with her, a gap in the timeline, a detail about exactly when he'd actually arrived home that didn't fully line up with a separate neighbor's account of headlights on Larkspur Lane. But by the end of that interview, Daniel Rich was no longer her primary suspect. Grace Coleman was. Picks up a final highlighter, sweeps it along the cheekbone, catching the light. And when Okafor's team finally tracked Grace down at her apartment outside Pittsburgh, ready to bring her in for questioning about the murder of the aunt who'd stolen her mother's name and her own cousin's sudden disappearance. Grace Coleman wasn't there. The apartment was empty. Cleared out. Not a single trace of where she'd gone. But sitting on the kitchen counter, almost like it had been left there on purpose, was a single sealed envelope with one word written across the front. Eleanor. Picking up a lash curler now, hands a little too still, like she's bracing herself before the next part. Okay. I need you to actually put your brush down for this one, because this is the part of the story that flipped everything I thought I understood about the Rich case completely on its head. When Detective Okafor's team opened that sealed envelope on Grace Coleman's kitchen counter, they weren't reading a confession. They weren't reading a goodbye letter, or a manifesto, or anything close to what you'd expect from a woman who'd allegedly just helped commit a murder and vanished with a missing girl. They were reading a letter Grace had written to Eleanor nearly 2 months earlier, before Eleanor ever sent that first cryptic text about the locket. Before any of this had even started, at least from the public's perspective. Curls lashes carefully, voice slowing down. In the letter, Grace explained that she hadn't reached out to Eleanor first. Eleanor had found her. On her own. Through old church records, just like the burner phone messages later instructed, except Eleanor had already started that search months before she ever got a single text from Grace. By the time Eleanor messaged a stranger on a genealogy forum asking about Voss family records from a small Pennsylvania town, Grace had already spent 5 years quietly building her own case, certain something was wrong with the official story of that fire, certain her mother hadn't simply abandoned her. The two of them, cousins who'd never met, found each other independently, from opposite directions, chasing the same buried truth. Picks up second mascara coat, applies with deliberate slowness. Grace wrote that she'd actually tried to talk Eleanor out of confronting her mother directly. She'd warned her, repeatedly, in those texts, don't tell her not yet, it isn't safe, because Grace herself was terrified of what a cornered Margaret might be capable of. She'd spent years imagining her aunt as a monster who let a sister die and stole a life without a second thought. She didn't trust what that kind of person would do if exposed. But Eleanor didn't listen. The letter said Eleanor had grown impatient, increasingly desperate for the truth, increasingly haunted by the idea that she'd spent her entire childhood being raised by a stranger wearing her real aunt's stolen face. And 3 days before the murder, Eleanor told Grace she was done waiting. She was going to confront her mother. That night. Sets mascara down, hand trembling slightly now. Grace begged her not to. Eleanor didn't respond to her last 3 messages. And then, on the night of October 14th, at 11:58 p.m., 6 minutes before Carol Whitfield heard that single cut-off shout, Eleanor finally called Grace's phone. Not texted. Called. Grace wrote, in that letter, that she would never forget the sound of her cousin's voice in those first few seconds. Eleanor wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She sounded, in Grace's own words, completely hollow, like she wasn't even fully inside her own body anymore. Eleanor said 5 words before the call cut off. Mom knows. I think she's. The call ended there. Disconnected. Grace called back 4 times. No answer. Picks up a final coat of clear gloss, hand still shaking slightly while she applies it. So Grace did the only thing she could think to do. She got in her car at midnight and drove 4 hours straight through the night toward Maple Hollow, toward a cousin she'd never once met in person, toward a house she'd never set foot inside, with absolutely no idea what she was about to walk into. By the time she arrived, just before dawn, the police were already there. Patricia, Margaret, was already gone. And Eleanor was nowhere to be found. Grace never made it inside that house that night. She wasn't there when Patricia died. She didn't take Eleanor. She didn't kidnap her cousin, didn't orchestrate any disappearance, didn't lay a single hand on the woman at the bottom of those stairs. Which means somebody else was in that house with Eleanor and Patricia in those final 6 minutes before midnight. And whoever it was, they're still out there. Setting all the brushes down now, completely still, looking straight ahead. Okay you guys, I need you to take a breath with me for this one, because this is it. This is the part where everything finally clicks into place, and honestly, When I first put these pieces together while researching this case, I actually had to stop and sit with it for a few minutes before I could keep going. Here's what really happened inside that house on Larkspur Lane, in those final 6 minutes before midnight. Eleanor confronted her mother exactly the way she'd told Grace she would. She walked into the kitchen where Margaret, still Patricia to her, still Mom, even with all this doubt swirling in her head, was finishing up some late-night paperwork from the flower shop. And Eleanor laid it all out. The locket. The diary. The church records. The family tree built across weeks of secret research. She asked her mother, point blank, the question she'd been too scared to ask for 6 months. Are you actually my aunt? Did my real mom die in that fire? Voice quiet, steady, almost a whisper. According to what Daniel would eventually admit, not in that first interview, but much later, after the full weight of everything caught up with him, Margaret didn't deny it. She couldn't. Not with that much evidence sitting on the kitchen table in front of her. And something in her completely broke. 30 years of carefully maintained composure, the warm flower shop smile, the casseroles, the church volunteering, all of it just collapsed in an instant. Margaret grabbed Eleanor's phone off the counter mid-call, the exact moment Eleanor was saying those 5 words to Grace, "Mom knows, I think she's," and threw it across the room. Eleanor backed toward the stairs, frightened, finally seeing a version of her mother she'd never witnessed before. Margaret followed her, grabbing her arm hard enough to leave the bruising investigators later found, except it wasn't on Margaret's arms at all in that moment. It was on Eleanor's. Picks up a tissue, presses it gently under her eyes even though there's no real tears yet, just instinct. That's when Daniel walked through the front door. He'd actually come home early that night, not from a fake job site, but because something had felt wrong to him all day, a feeling he couldn't shake. And he walked in just in time to see his wife gripping their daughter's arm at the top of the staircase, both of them shouting, Eleanor trying to pull free. Daniel rushed up those stairs and grabbed Margaret to pull her off Eleanor. In the chaos, in that single, terrible, irreversible second, Margaret lost her footing. Daniel's hand caught her sleeve, trying to steady her, trying to stop the fall, and that's exactly where those scratches on his knuckles came from. Not panic. Not grief. A genuine, desperate attempt to catch his wife before she hit the ground. He failed. Sets the tissue down, completely still. Patricia Rich, Margaret Voss, fell backward down that staircase and struck her head on the newel post at the bottom, the same kind of blunt force injury the medical examiner had identified from the very beginning. She died almost instantly. And Eleanor, 17 years old in that moment even though she was 26, completely regressed back into a terrified child watching her entire world implode, ran. She didn't run because anyone chased her. She didn't run because she was being kidnapped. She ran because she'd just watched her mother die in front of her, moments after learning her mother's entire identity was a lie, and her mind simply could not process staying in that house for one more second. Daniel made the single worst decision of his life in the minutes that followed. Instead of calling 911 immediately and telling the truth, he panicked. He thought about how it would look, a violent struggle, his hands on his wife in her final moments, his daughter vanished from the scene. He thought, in his words later, if I tell them what really happened, they're going to think I did this, and they're going to think Eleanor did this, and neither one of us touched her with the intent to hurt her. So he drove off, parked 3 blocks away, and tried to figure out what to do, and ended up doing nothing at all except sitting frozen behind the wheel until police found him. Looks up, finally, eyes glassy but composed. Which leaves us with the only question that actually still matters here. Where did Eleanor go? Because she didn't go to Grace. She didn't go to any friend investigators interviewed. For weeks, this 26-year-old woman simply vanished off the face of the earth, leaving an entire town, an entire investigation, and one heartbroken cousin desperately searching for any sign of her. And the answer to where Eleanor Rich had actually been all this time is, honestly, one of the most quietly devastating details in this entire case. Picking up a soft setting powder brush, dabbing gently, almost absent-mindedly, like the routine is the only thing keeping her hand steady. So here's where Eleanor Rich had actually been for those 5 excruciating weeks while half the country was watching her face flash across news segments and missing persons alerts. She'd walked. Just walked, that first night, for nearly 6 hours in the dark, until she ended up almost 40 miles away in a town called Birchwood Creek, where nobody recognized her and nobody was looking for her yet. She had about $300 in cash in her jacket pocket, money she'd been saving for months, ironically, in case she ever needed to leave home quickly once she learned the truth about her mother. She checked into a roadside motel called the Pinecrest Inn under a name that wasn't hers, paid in cash, and simply stayed. Day after day. Barely eating. Barely sleeping. Watching the news coverage of her own disappearance on a small motel television, paralyzed by a guilt she couldn't even fully name yet. Blends powder slowly under the eyes. She told investigators later that for the first several days, she genuinely believed she'd be arrested the moment she came forward, not for hurting her mother, because she hadn't, but for somehow causing all of it simply by asking the question that broke her mother open in the first place. In her mind, in that fractured, traumatized state, the confrontation itself felt like the crime. It was the motel's owner, a quiet man in his 60s named Walter Pruitt, who finally recognized her from a grainy photo on the local news after she'd been there almost 5 weeks. He didn't call the police immediately. He told investigators later that he sat down across from her at the little motel office counter, made her a cup of instant coffee, and simply said, "I think it's time somebody knew you were safe." Eleanor cried for the first time in 5 weeks, sitting in that motel office, and finally agreed to let him call. Sets the powder brush down, picks up a soft pink blush instead, something warmer. When Eleanor was finally reunited with her father, it wasn't the tearful, relieved embrace you might expect from a true crime documentary ending. It was quieter than that. Heavier. Because by then, Daniel had already been arrested and charged, not with murder, but with obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence, for fleeing the scene and lying about the timeline of that night. The DA's office, after reviewing the medical examiner's findings alongside Daniel's eventual full confession, ultimately agreed the death itself had been a tragic accident during a desperate attempt to protect his daughter, not an intentional act of violence. Daniel ultimately pled guilty to the obstruction charges and received 18 months, most of which was served before Eleanor even fully re-entered public life. Eleanor herself was never charged with anything. She hadn't laid a hand on her mother. She'd simply asked a question her mother had spent 30 years avoiding, and the answer had cost everyone everything. Sweeps blushed gently along the apples of the cheeks. Grace Coleman and Eleanor finally met in person about 6 weeks after Eleanor was found, 2 cousins, raised 4 hours and an entire lifetime apart, both robbed of a mother in completely different ways by the same secret. By all accounts, that first meeting was excruciating and beautiful in equal measure. They cried together. They sat with old photographs together, the ones from that faded picture in the lockbox, 2 young women in front of a burned farmhouse, finally able to put real names, the real names, to those faces. Grace told a local reporter, much later, something that I think about a lot when I'm doing these stories. She said, "I spent my whole life thinking I was unwanted. Turns out I was just unlucky. There's a difference. And it took losing an aunt I never even got to confront properly to finally understand that." Picks up a final lip gloss, applies it slowly, almost reverently. As for Maple Hollow itself, the town did what small towns always do. They mourned the woman they thought they knew, even while struggling to reconcile her with the woman the case file revealed. Hollow Blooms, the flower shop, eventually reopened under new ownership, though longtime customers say it never quite felt the same. Carol Whitfield, the neighbor who heard that single cut-off shout and waited until morning to act, reportedly still keeps her porch light on every single night now, without exception, rain or snow, as if making up, in some small impossible way, for the one night she didn't. And somewhere out there, in that strange in-between space of grief and relief, Eleanor Rich is rebuilding a life she barely recognizes anymore, with a father she still loves but can no longer fully look at the same way, and a cousin who became, against every odd, the only person who truly understood exactly what she'd lost. So what do we actually take away from a story like this? Setting every brush down now, looking at her own finished face in the mirror, simple and quiet. You know, when I sat down to put this story together, I kept coming back to one thing that just wouldn't let go of me. This wasn't really a story about a murder at all, not deep down. It was a story about identity, about how far someone will go to bury who they really are, and how that burial never actually stays buried. It just waits. Patiently. For 30 years if it has to. And then it comes back up through the floorboards of the people who loved that lie the most. Margaret Voss spent 3 decades building Patricia rich, a kind woman, a generous neighbor, a devoted mother, almost like a second skin she never took off. And maybe, in some strange way, she even became that person. Maybe the kindness was real, even if the name wasn't. I think that's actually the part of this story that unsettles me the most. That you can build something good on top of something broken, and for a while, nobody can tell the difference. Not even you. Soft exhale. But secrets like that always need a keeper. Daniel kept it for 5 years. Eleanor unburied it in 6 months. And Grace Coleman spent her entire life on the outside of it, paying a cost she never even fully understood until she was already an adult sitting in a Pittsburgh apartment, piecing together a family tree that explained why she'd grown up feeling like she belonged to no one. I think about Eleanor a lot, honestly. 26 years old, just trying to ask her mom an honest question, and ending up losing everything in the span of 6 minutes. I think about how easy it is to forget that the people who raise us are also just people, flawed, frightened, sometimes running from something we'll never fully see until it's far too late to ask gently. And I think about Carol Whitfield's porch light, burning every single night now, a small quiet act of penance for a hesitation that maybe, just maybe, could have changed how that night ended. Looks directly into the camera, gentle, sincere. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: ask your questions while there's still time for soft answers. Because sometimes the truth doesn't wait for a good moment to come out. Sometimes it just falls down the stairs in the middle of the night, and by morning, nothing is ever the same again. Thank you so much for sitting with me through this one. I know it was heavy. I know it was a lot. But that's exactly why we're here, isn't it? To sit in the dark together for a little while, and come out the other side a little more careful with the people we love. If you like this channel or story, don't forget to subscribe. Please subscribe to Blush and Blood.